A motorcyclist shoved a royal guard to the floor, thinking he was showing how tough he was. But as the guard got up from the pavement, that moment of victory became one of fear. One firm hold was all it needed to show him the difference between actual power and just showing off. This is what went on, but before we go on, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Also, subscribe to the channel if you respect the royal guards. The morning air at Windsor Castle was unusually cold, the sort that made visitors zip up their coats as they waited to see the changing of the guard. Guard David Smith was at his station, his red uniform standing out against the old stone walls. 8 years in the army were clear from the way he stood, perfectly still. The first hint of trouble was the faraway rumble of a motorbike, not the gentle sound of a tourist's bike, but the angry roar of one that had been heavily changed. The noise got louder, slicing through the quiet chatter of the crowd like a knife. Guard Smith's eyes stayed looking ahead, but his battle-trained senses noticed every bit of the approaching danger. The motorbike that stopped at the edge of the road was as black as the rider's mood. Chrome skulls were stuck on the handlebars, and various Viking symbols that had been twisted from their real meaning into something bad were across the petrol tank. The rider, a huge man whose leather jacket barely covered his big body, got off very slowly. His boots, with steel toes, hit the ground heavily. Different patches were on his jacket, some with symbols that had made good people shiver since the 1940s. A cheap-looking iron cross was on a chain around his neck, not the real army medal it copied, but a fake one that hinted at fake glory and twisted ideas. "You know what I think when I see you." The biker walked around Guard Smith, his shadow crossing the spotless uniform. "I see everything that's rubbish in this world. All this." He waved rudely at the castle walls. "Old ways and rules make me feel ill." Guard Smith didn't move, his control learned in places where much more risky men had tried to test him. His eyes stayed ahead, but every muscle was set, every sense sharp. Years of being in the army had taught him to spot threats, and this one was getting bigger, just like in a textbook. "Hey, toy soldier!" The biker's voice got louder, trying to cause trouble. "I'm talking to you." He got closer, stepping into the carefully kept space around Guard Smith's post. His huge body made a shadow over the guard's shiny boots, like a storm cloud about to burst. A couple from Germany quickly grabbed their kids, pulling them away from what was about to happen. The biker saw them leave and sneered. "Look at that! People still running scared, just like years ago, eh?" His laugh was horrible, reminding people of ideas that had once made Europe go through a dark time. The morning sun hit the iron cross hanging from his neck, a fake version of the real army medal. His jacket, covered in patches that would have been banned in several European countries, stretched as he puffed out his chest. "But you'll just stay there, won't you? All rules and doing what you're told." He spat the words out like they were horrible. An older man wearing a Royal Marines veteran badge stepped forward, his face tight with knowing what was about to happen. But before he could say anything, the biker turned his head quickly, staring at him with a look that had made many others shut up. "Stay out of this, old man. Your lot had your go." Guard Smith's eyes stayed ahead, but his battle-trained senses followed every move. From tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, he'd learned to spot the signs of a fight about to start. The small changes in weight, the twitching of fingers, the changes in breathing. The biker was showing them all. "You know what your problem is?" The biker went round again, his boots scratching against the floor like a bull getting ready to attack. "You're part of the system that's making everyone weak. All these rules, all this showing off." He waved at the castle walls. "While the proper men, the tough ones, are out there being free." His voice was heard across the courtyard, where more visitors had stopped to watch. Some had moved back to what they thought was a safe distance, while others stood still, unable to stop watching the build-up to the fight that was sure to happen. He turned towards the voice, making several people jump. "Why am I cross?" he shouted, showing off to his forced audience. "Because while proper men like me are keeping the old ways alive, everyone worships these." He turned back to guard Smith, his face twisted with disgust. "These toy soldiers, these protectors of weakness." What came next happened with the simple force of a hammer hitting steel. The biker, his patience finally gone because of guard Smith's steady control, moved surprisingly fast for his size. His leather jacket creaked with the quick move, chains jangling against metal studs as his huge body went forward. "Let's see how tough your precious rules are," he growled, huge hands shooting forward. The push was planned, done with the skill of someone who'd spent years getting good at causing trouble. His hands hit guard Smith's chest, hard enough to make the soldier fall back, leather-covered arms stretching fully as years of bullying and fighting came out in one big push. The hit carried the weight of many pub fights and backstreet brawls, each one adding to the biker's belief that being strong was all that mattered. Guard Smith's boots scratched against the old stones as he tried to stay standing, the sound of metal heels against the rock making a loud noise that seemed to cut through the morning. For a tiny bit of time, his perfect position wobbled, his ceremonial rifle tilting as he started to fall. The sunlight caught his bra's buttons one last time before it happened. Then, with a sound that echoed off the castle walls like a bang, he fell. The fall wasn't over the top, no pretend acting, just the simple fact of a body hitting hard ground. His ceremonial rifle banged against the stones, the sound seeming to go through the very bottom of Windsor Castle itself. The biker's laugh filled the courtyard, deep and nasty, going across the old stones like thunder. "Look at your great protector now." He lifted his arms in victory, big fists clenched above his head, his shape making a dark shadow over the fallen guard. The sunlight hit his knuckle tattoos, those twisted runes that had seen many bad things, each one telling its own story of hate. Viking symbols that used to mean power and goodness now changed into signs of hate shone on his skin. "Not so perfect now, are you?" Several visitors gasped, their phones forgotten in hands that covered shocked faces. A child started to cry somewhere in the crowd, the sound quickly covered by a parent's hug. The old veteran took 2 steps forward before his friend grabbed his arm, both men knowing that this had gone past normal people being able to help. Their faces showed the sad look of men who had seen this sort of belief before, in places where history had been written in blood. A young mum pulled her kids behind a stone pillar, her face tight with worry, protecting them from the show of force winning over calm. "This," the biker turned to speak to his forced audience, arms still lifted in victory, his voice showing the practiced way of someone who had given similar talks in dark pubs and secret meetings. "This is what happens when you trust weakness in old ways." His voice showed years of practiced talk, the same bad belief that had once marched across Europe, now echoing off old British stones. Each word was full of dislike for the values the uniform stood for. "Real power doesn't follow rules. Real men don't hide behind old ways." Guard Smith lay there for exactly 3 seconds. His ceremonial rifle had landed next to him, the metal somehow not marked by its fall, the shiny surface showing the morning sun like a mirror. His cap had moved a bit, showing eyes that no longer had any sign of show or parade ground rules. Those eyes had seen war in places where real power meant something very different from what this biker said. They held the calm look of a hunter about to attack. "Hail victory!" the biker shouted, turning his back on the fallen guard to face the crowd, his arms still lifted. His victory pose changed into something darker, more like something bad from history. The iron cross swung from his neck like a clock's pendulum, marking the moments before trouble, catching the light with each move. Its sharp edges seemed to cut through the morning air, a sign of everything that had once nearly destroyed the very way of life these guards protected. "See how easily your protector falls. See how quickly old ways break in front of real power. But he'd made a big mistake, one that men like him, full of their own feeling of being better, often made. A mistake that cost others dearly on real battlefields, where Guard Smith had earned his right to wear the red uniform. He'd thought that following rules meant weakness, that control meant giving in, that a guard's show position meant he'd forgotten how to fight. His big head had made him blind to the years of battle training hidden under the show outside. Most importantly, he'd turned his back on a soldier who'd earned his uniform not in shows, but in war, a soldier who had faced real enemies, in places where winning wasn't measured in crowd cheers and showy displays, but in staying alive and protecting values worth dying for. The biker, still enjoying his win that he thought he'd got, never saw what was about to happen. His arms stayed lifted in that horrible salute, his mouth open, still boasting, as Guard Smith did a move that had nothing to do with show and everything to do with fighting skill. The morning sun caught the guard's brass buttons one last time as he got ready to show the difference between showy power and real planned skill. He moved with the smooth skill of a hunter. His getting up from the ground wasn't the showy move visitors took pictures of during the changing of the guard. This was pure fighting skill, each muscle following years of battle training. Before the biker's shout of victory could disappear, Smith's white-gloved hand grabbed his shoulder with great force. The hold wasn't just strong, it was perfectly planned. Smith's fingers found pressure points that the biker's pub fights hadn't made him ready for, and the sudden pain broke his feeling of winning. Before he could even understand what was going on, Smith did a perfect hip throw that would have made his battle teachers proud. The biker's huge body went into the air for a tiny bit of time, his arm still partly lifted in that horrible salute. Then gravity took over, and 200 pounds of so-called real power crashed onto the old stones with a sound that echoed off the castle walls. His leather jacket scraped against the floor, and the cheap iron cross around his neck broke on hitting the ground. But Smith wasn't finished. Before the biker could even feel the shock of hitting the ground, the guard's boot pressed into his chest with planned pressure. Not enough to really hurt him, but more than enough to show total control. The shiny toe cap shone in the morning sun, a sign of control, pinning down the example of mess. Go on. Smith's voice had the quiet confidence of someone who'd led men in real war. Show your real power now. His foot kept perfect pressure as the biker struggled, unable to do anything against the hold. Each move just showed how completely he was trapped, how much his feeling of being better had been broken. The biker's face twisted with anger and shock. His huge arms tried to push against the pressure, muscles bulging under tattoos that showed hate. But Smith's position was perfect. Each try to get up, just leading to another sore reminder of who had the real power. Can't move, can you? Smith's voice stayed calm, professional. Funny how all that hate, all that so-called power, is nothing against proper training. His boot moved a bit, finding another pressure point that made the biker's next try even harder. The biker tried to spit out an answer, but Smith's position made even that simple thing hard. Those men learned what you're learning now. That real power isn't about bullying, it's about control, being in charge, the very things you laugh at because you can't understand them. A drop of sweat ran down the biker's forehead, going through the dirt left by his hitting the ground. His next try was weaker, the truth of what was happening finally starting to get to him. The patches on his jacket, symbols of hate and so-called power, were now marked with the dust of his loss. You see, Smith's voice had a bit of steel in it. While you were practicing bullying in pubs, I was learning real fighting in war zones. While you were getting symbols of hate, I was earning medals protecting the freedom you misuse. His boot moved again, keeping control with skill. The power you pretend to have, we use it to keep people safe from men like you. The biker's face had turned a strange color. partly from trying so hard, partly from the shame of being so completely beaten. His next words came out in a strained breath. "You can't do this." "Actually," Smith answered, his voice showing the weight of the law, "I can. The moment you touched a Queen's Guard, you gave me every right to do what I needed to." His hold stayed perfect, even though the biker kept trying. "And right now, I'm only using a tiny bit of what I'm allowed to use. Let me tell you something about the uniform you just disrespected." Smith's voice cut through the morning air with military detail. His boot stayed firmly on the biker's chest, each struggle met with planned pressure that showed years of battle training. "During World War II, men wearing this uniform stood against everything you stand for." The biker tried to get away, but Smith's positioning was perfect. Each move just showed how totally he was controlled. "Your sort," Smith went on, "marched across Europe wearing symbols just like the ones on your jacket. They thought that they were the best example of power, too." Smith's white gloves stayed clean, even though he'd fallen earlier, a sign of the same care that made his battle holds impossible to escape. "They learned what you're learning now, that real power isn't about bullying, it's not about hate. It's about control, training, and the willingness to stand against men like you." "You don't understand," the biker gasped, his face twisted with anger and growing fear. "We're the real what?" Smith's voice had an edge that had been made stronger in real war. "The real men? The strong ones?" Mitchell's boot shifted slightly, finding another pressure point that made the biker's next struggle even more futile. "Let me explain something about real strength. I've fought in places you couldn't find on a map, against enemies who'd make you look like a child playing in a playground." The morning sun caught Mitchell's medals, not just decorations for show, but awards earned in war zones where the difference between being strong and weak was a matter of life or death. "This uniform represents everything that stopped your kind 70 years ago. Every button, every fold, every medal stands for the win of control over mindless violence." The biker's next attempt to break free was met with such precisely applied pressure that he could only make a frustrated noise. His patches and symbols, which had seemed so scary minutes ago, now looked cheap and pointless against the real authority Mitchell showed. "You want to know what real strength looks like?" Mitchell's voice carried across the courtyard, where tourists stood in respectful silence. "It's standing guard for hours, in any weather, keeping control while tourists make fun and drunk people try to cause trouble. It's representing hundreds of years of tradition that protected this country from men who wore the very symbols you show off so proudly." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a tone that carried steel beneath its professional calm. "But most importantly, it's having the power to break you." His boot shifted again, demonstrating just how easily he could increase the pressure. "And choosing not to. That's the difference between us. You worship power without understanding it. We master it without worshipping it." The biker's face had lost some of its arrogance, but his eyes still burned with hatred. His mouth opened, probably to say more hateful things, but Mitchell's next words stopped him. "Take a good look around you," Mitchell ordered. "Look at these walls. They've stood against stronger men than you. This uniform, it's guarded kings and queens, stood firm against real threats, not weekend warriors playing at being tough." His voice carried the weight of every soldier who'd ever worn the uniform. "The same control you laughed at earlier. It's what's keeping you conscious right now." The elderly veteran who'd watched earlier stepped forward, his medals for being in battles catching the light. "I served in Northern Ireland," he announced, his voice carrying the same quiet authority as Mitchell's. "Faced men who thought violence made them powerful. They learned the same lesson you're learning now, that real strength serves something bigger than itself." Mitchell's boot hadn't moved an inch, maintaining the same precise pressure that had controlled the biker from the start. "So here's what's going to happen," Mitchell stated, his tone making it clear this wasn't a discussion. "The police are on their way. You're going to be charged with attacking a Queen's Guard, a serious crime that carries serious punishments." His eyes locked onto the biker's face, battle-hardened gaze meeting hatred without looking away. "But more importantly, you're going to remember this moment. Every time you look in the mirror and see those symbols of supposed strength, you'll remember how easily real discipline beat them." The sound of police sirens coming closer cut through the morning air, mixing with the biker's heavy breathing. Mitchell maintained his perfect control, the pressure of his boot not changing as two police officers hurried into the courtyard. Their faces showed they'd been told about the situation. This wasn't their first time dealing with someone who'd learned the hard way about respecting the Queen's Guard. "Assault on a Queen's Guard," the first officer stated, his tone professional but carrying a hint of disgust as he noticed the symbols on the biker's jacket. "That's a serious offense, sir." The word "sir" carried none of the respect it usually did. As the officers moved to take control, Mitchell executed a perfect tactical handover. His boot lifted from the biker's chest with the same precision he'd shown throughout, allowing the police to handcuff the still struggling man. The biker's attempts to resist were met with quick, professional restraint. "You'll regret this," the biker spat as the handcuffs clicked shut. "My brothers will what?" Mitchell cut him off, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had dominated the whole event. "Come test their strength against real training. Please do. Encourage them." His eyes, no longer showing any trace of ceremonial patience, locked onto the biker's face. "We'll be here." The biker's face twisted with helpless rage as the officers led him away. His boots, which had walked so confidently earlier, now scraped awkwardly against the stones. The patches and symbols on his jacket seemed to shrink under the morning sun, their fake threat shown to be empty in the face of genuine authority. Mitchell's attention turned to his fallen rifle. With movements that showed years of training, he picked it up from the ground, checking it for damage with practiced skill. Finding none, he returned to his post with parade-ground precision. His uniform, despite the earlier fight, remained remarkably neat, a testament to the same attention to detail that had allowed him to control a much larger opponent. The elderly veteran approached, pausing a respectful distance from Mitchell's post. "Royal Marines, 82 to 95, he stated quietly. "Good to see the standards haven't dropped." His campaign medals caught the light as he straightened to attention and offered a crisp salute. Mitchell's eyes remained forward, but his posture acknowledged the veteran's presence. The moment passed between them without need for further words. Two soldiers, separated by years, but united in understanding what the uniform truly represented. The crowd began to leave, but their usual chatter was quieter. Parents led their children away, many taking the chance to explain the difference between real strength and the kind that had just been so thoroughly defeated. The German tourists from earlier had returned, their faces showing grim satisfaction at seeing symbols of hate beaten by disciplined authority. A few yards away, one of the biker's patches lay in the dust, where it had been torn loose during his fall. The Viking rune it displayed, meant to symbolize strength, now seemed pathetically small against the backdrop of Windsor Castle's ancient walls. A street cleaner would later throw it away without a second thought, putting it in the same rubbish bin where similar symbols had ended up years ago. As the day continued at Windsor Castle, tourists came and went, many unaware of the morning's events. But those who had seen it carried away something more valuable than photos or gifts. They had seen the reality behind the ceremonial front, the steel beneath the red uniform. Guard Mitchell continued his watch, his bearing perfect, his attention focused forward. To casual observers, he appeared exactly as he had before the incident, a ceremonial guard keeping his watch. But those who looked closer might notice subtle differences, the way his boots were planted more firmly on the stones, how his grip on the rifle carried the readiness of recent combat, the heightened awareness in his stance that spoke of lessons learned in battle and reinforced in the heart of London. What makes a uniform more than just material and brass? Is it the traditions it represents, or the character of those who wear it? Perhaps, as we witnessed today, it's both, the perfect mix of historical dignity and present-day strength, ready to stand firm against those who mistake ceremony for weakness. The next time you see a Queen's Guard standing motionless at their post, remember this. Behind that ceremonial stance lies years of combat training. Under that bearskin cap is a soldier who has likely served in the world's most dangerous places. Those who mistake their discipline for weakness do so at their own risk. What would you do if faced with such a show of disrespect? Would you have the discipline to wait for the right moment, or would you let anger take over? Share your thoughts in the comments below.